For those of you who were paying attention yesterday afternoon, were figures released by Stats Canada, which, by the way, were in the last census in 2021. I'm not sure how important that is to note because these are the most current figures we have. So, yes, they're released now in 2023, but the census was in 2021. The story is that according to this census release, now for the first time ever in a census, more than half of those residing in Quebec can carry on a conversation in English. So, ladies and gentlemen, English is not dead. In fact,
alive. It's alive.
Yeah.
It's alive.
I know. Reason to be excited, I'm sure. Let's find out a little bit more about this. Jack JEDWAB is on the line. Jack, I don't know where you start on this story other than this is good news. This is not. How is this going to be perceived, do you think?
Well, it depends by who it's perceived. I
True.
suppose from the standpoint of the government of Quebec, it's probably not going to be well perceived because there's that zero-sum type of thinking where English is doing well. That means French is not doing well.
You know, I said I took some heart in the fact that it's been almost a whole day, and I've not heard a single person in government react to this, which I guess is a good thing. We'll have to wait and see. Break down the numbers here. What do they actually suggest in terms of how things have changed or how English has become, if I can use the word, a bit more dominant?
Well, I don't know that it's become even a bit more dominant. What's really happening in terms of the way in which the data gets presented in this particular case by StatsCan is that we're looking at change in real numbers, not so much in percentage terms. So we need to understand what underlies those changes. And in effect, as you mentioned, if you look back at previous census releases from 2021 on language, we have seen considerable increases in the extent to which francophones are able to speak English. So there's been substantial increase in bilingualism amongst francophones over that period, on the one hand, which is a major contributing factor to this. And on the other hand, whether the Quebec government acknowledges it or not, many of the immigrants coming here are also able to speak both French and English. So the government will prioritize immigrants that are able to speak French within the part of the selection system that they oversee, which is economic, that is to say the skilled segment of the immigration selection. But around the world today, whether it's in the Maghreb or many other parts of the planet where there are French speakers, so most of those people are able to speak English as well. So they come here, they're able to speak both French and English, hence, contributing to that expansion of knowledge of English, which really is speaking to the increase in bilingualism.
So one of the figures in here, again, because it's interesting once you break the numbers down, proportion of Quebec residents who can converse in English and whose first language is French, they say that has reached an all-time high as well.
Right. So the level of bilingualism amongst francophones is probably the most important contributing factor to the expansion in overall knowledge of English. And as I said as well, immigrants coming here, although the government doesn't acknowledge it publicly, are to a significant degree, especially those coming to Montreal, bilingual. And why wouldn't they be? If they're just looking at the pattern of acquisition of English on the part of francophones, which is rising quite substantially, then they're going to say, hey, if it's good for the francophones, it can't be bad for those of us who are newcomers to also be able to be bilingual. Being bilingual means you know both French and English, hence any expansion in bilingualism on the part of non-Anglophones is going to increase the extent to which people say they know English in real numbers, which is the way that, by and large, it's being presented in this edition of StatsCan's release, although they are pointing to the percentage increase amongst francophones and bilingualism.
So the same, however, as it points out, cannot be said for French conversation, right?
The same in real numbers would be true for the ability to speak French. There's been substantial increases in real numbers in people's ability to speak French. That's not what this study is speaking to. But, immigrants coming here are able, to the extent they're able to speak both French and English, and the majority of those immigrants, which is again, we know immigration is the thing that's the biggest contributing factor to fueling population growth. To the extent those immigrants, which they do, are able to speak French, it's going to, in real numbers, also fuel increased knowledge of French. And the workplace, which there's a segment of this report that looks at workplace changes in terms of language knowledge. Over that same period they're looking at, there's been a substantial increase in knowledge of French amongst workers and use of French in real numbers.
Yeah, what it does say in here, though, which is of note, of those who speak English, about 10% could convert, only 10% really, when you look at it, could converse in English but not in French. That's a number that's going to be, I'm sure, brought up by the government too.
Yeah, I suspect they'll, look at whatever numbers that suit the particular narrative that they feel is supporting whatever language policies they choose to introduce based on the way in which they describe the threat to French. But at the same time, what we need to look at really is the relationship between the security, if you like, of French and the way in which bilingualism is viewed as an asset by a very large segment of the Quebec population.
Should mention, but people will ask the question. I think it's fair to ask until you sort of put it in context. This was done in 2021. That's before Bill 96. Some people say, well, after Bill 96, it's not going to be the same. But I don't think you can necessarily equate one with the other, can you?
No, I don't think Bill 96 has that type of impact in terms of the demographics. The demographics in terms of immigrants' knowledge of English and French, respectively, are determined by the selection process on the part of the government of Quebec, in particular, because it controls most of the, selection on the part of newcomers here. And at the same time, it's also going to be determined, at least in terms of knowledge of English, by the extent to which Francophones choose to learn English, and they're doing so to an increasing degree because the labor market, at least parts of the labor market, which this study points to in certain areas, where for example, technology-related trades and others, do require, a high degree of bilingualism, it appears. And, we are in North America, not just in Quebec. And so I think, Francophones understand that increasingly. There's also a lot more interaction mixing between Anglophones and Francophones. So you walk down the streets of Montreal, and you're going to hear people going back and forth in English and French quite comfortably. And, some people say that's great, and some people, like some columnists, I won't name in the Journal de Montréal, will say that's the end of the planet.
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned Montreal, so it's not surprising to see that happening here, but this StatsCan release seems to imply this is not just here. This is across many parts of Quebec.
Yeah, you're going to see, again, immigrants coming here, are very dominantly bilingual, if you like, and they're coming, those who come, whether they come to Montreal or other parts of Quebec, that's going to contribute to further expansion of English. And Francophones, whether it's in Montreal or outside Montreal, to a lesser extent outside of Montreal, because they don't have the opportunity to interact as much in English as they do in Montreal, are also still learning English to a greater extent than they have been previously. There's that whole globalization thing that, is out there that probably, from an economic standpoint, encourages people to learn 2, and if they can learn 3 languages, that's even better.
I'm sure this was not in the StatsCan question, right? The idea, well, where have you been learning this or have you become more proficient? I mean, if we look at something like the internet, right, and people all the time, basically the internet is all about English, right? Even if you post in French, when you're just scrolling, you're going to get most of your stuff in English as well. That wasn't asked here, but would it make sense to believe a lot of it comes from that, do you think?
Some of it comes from that, but, it raises another issue about translation. I've been doing some research on this lately in terms of the extent to which people are using automated or machine translations. And, you look at the content on Quebec websites where they're restricting, access basically in terms of information to make it in French only, with the exception of Investissement Québec and Bonjour Québec, the sort of tourism-related sites where they, have a lot of English posted. But you could just translate all this stuff. You go online, copy-paste it, boom, you put a Google Translate, DeepL, whichever one. And so these aren't effective restrictions. People are, using translation devices to more easily communicate. I get people coming up to me in all kinds of languages, and they're sort of saying something in Urdu in their watch, which I look at their watch, and then it appears in English, and it's sort of, with those nice watches with a little larger screen, and I answer back, and it's being translated into Urdu, and answering in English. I mean, the planet's changing in terms of the way in which we communicate in various languages. And we need to take a harder look at that. And governments do, including this government, need to take a much harder look at the way these translation technology changes are going to affect, our ability to, and use of both languages or multiple languages.
As you describe it, Jack, I mean, it would seem to me, I know we don't have another census for a few more years, but it would seem to me this trend is obviously going to continue. We're not going backwards, we're going forwards in terms of people streaming, getting on the internet, using these translation services. The numbers will probably, I imagine, to get even bigger.
Oh, 100%. I think the real issue going forward in some ways is whether, using those translation devices, which everybody, I think, on workplaces that require translation is using, even if they tell you they're using translators, they're certainly using these, translation systems first before someone kicks in and edits something. Is it going to be an incentive to sort of improving your skills in those languages, or is it going to be a disincentive for people saying, hey, I don't need to learn a language because I can just get it translated by this translation device, which is getting better every day.
That's a fair point. Jack JEDWAB, president of the Association for Canadian Studies, on these new StatsCan figures on people speaking English in Quebec. Jack, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.